Good morning, everyone. All right, I know it's early. We got to get the energy going. So one more time, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you. I'd like to thank Wes and David and the whole Robin Hood team for inviting me here today, and I think really bringing this group together. My colleague Raj Chetty at Opportunity Insights spoke here last year talking about our research, and I'd like to build on that, but really start to focus on how we can take that data and research and start to think about how we can do all of our work more effectively and more impactfully. Of course, data and research is important, but behind all those data points are millions of people and millions of stories. So how do we start to translate that research into real impact and action on the ground? So for example, my mom grew up in Iowa in a one-room schoolhouse. My dad's from Lagos, Nigeria. And my dad came to America. My mother moved to Detroit to follow and find the American dream. But for someone who looks like me, right, that dream has become increasingly fleeting. For African American men growing up in the Detroit metro area, they only have a 15% chance of going to college and graduating from college. And they're 5 times more likely to end up in jail than their white counterparts. So one thing we do at Opportunity Insights is to first think about how we can use data to actually name the issues that we're talking about. So again, that concept of the American dream is complicated. It's something that I think is very important to our ethos as a country. But how do you really get at exactly what it is and if we're living up to that standard? So what Raj and the team did was try and distill it down to a very simple statistic, right? So looking at the earnings of parents compared to their children using IRS records. And what we see is that for folks who were born in the 1940s, that idea of upward prosperity, of earning more than your parents, was almost a guarantee. Over 90% of individuals born in that decade grew up to earn more than their parents. But we've seen that that dream, the American dream, has become fleeting for many. So much so that by the time we get to the 1980s, for children born in that decade, that guarantee has become a 50-50 proposition, right? There's a 50% chance that you will now grow up to earn more than your parents. And in many ways, we feel that that's at the core of a lot of the political and cultural frustration that we see today. And it's our mission to use big data and research to help reverse trends like this. So again, we use big data to study upward mobility and economic opportunity, and we look at a range of different outcomes and issue areas. Right? So it's not just about housing or health, but how do we bring all those things together, right? All the work that we do, how do we work together, cross our silos, and figure out how we can work more impactfully and create real systemic and transformational change? And part of our research focuses on the importance of place and geography, and that's where I want to start today. So we created a tool called the Opportunity Atlas, and it takes data from 20 million children and their parents. We're able to identify where they grew up using the IRS records, so we know where their neighborhoods are, and we can measure the incomes of their parents when we were growing up, so we can specifically focus on kids who grew up in low-income households. And then through the data, we're able to track those same children into adulthood, wherever they move, and better understand what their outcomes are, how much they're earning in adulthood, incarceration rates, teen pregnancy rates, employment rates, and beyond. So we can really get a sense of not just point-in-time estimates of poverty, but intergenerational mobility, right? What is the chance that someone growing up in a low-income household can become prosperous, can enter the middle class, and move up the income ladder? And what we see is that there's great variety across the country in terms of economic mobility. You see in the Great Plains and those areas in deep blue, kids who grew up in families making around $27,000 on average earn upwards of $35,000 and $40,000. And these are the highest economic mobility rates that we see for any country that we have data for. Whereas in the Southeast, in the Rust Belt in places like Detroit and Cleveland, much lower rates of economic mobility, right? So children who grow up in low-income families, on average, remain low-income adults. Almost no economic mobility, and sometimes even kind of backwards rates of economic mobility, falling back down the income ladder. And interestingly, that same range of outcomes we see across the country, we see that reflected within every community in the country as well. So you see that same range of deep red to deep blue within a city like New York as well. Right? So places just a few miles away having very different outcomes for kids who are growing up in similarly low-income families. And so what I'd like to talk about today is, given this research, how do we move to that next step? How do we influence policy? And I'll use one example that we've been working on for the past few years, looking at housing policy in particular. So when you look at these maps and you're seeing these different outcomes in terms of neighborhoods, especially if you're a researcher, you're thinking about what's the actual causal impact, right? Is it the neighborhood that's having these effects, or is it just that certain types of people are moving to different kinds of places? And what we've done is that looking at 7 million families who moved across communities, understanding those patterns to get at that exact question. So what we see is that for one of these redder neighborhoods where outcomes are lower compared to a blue neighborhood with higher outcomes, if families move when a child is 2 years old to that higher opportunity place, that child on average earns almost as much as children who grew up their entire lifetime in that neighborhood. But for every year later that move is made, we see lower outcomes. And we see it so strongly in the data that even within the same family that makes one of these hypothetical moves, that older sibling who had more exposure to that higher opportunity place, on average earns more or earns less than the younger sibling who is exposed for more time, right? So it's not just about who's moving to these places, but there's a real causal impact. And we see that every year of that exposure really counts. So it doesn't just speak to making moves, but also it speaks to the impact that we can have on a child's life through programming and through other types of interventions. But one intuitive use of this data is because we're able to pinpoint these neighborhoods that have better outcomes for our low-income kids, what are the barriers that families face that might be trying to move to these places? Right? Is it that they're self-selecting certain places, or is it really barriers in the housing market, in the rental market, that are creating these dynamics? And I think Wes pointed to it. I think history, of course, tells us redlining, housing discrimination has created much of the segregation we see in our country today, but what can we do about it today with concrete policies? So one thing we can look at is how are our policies currently working? So we're looking at the Seattle metro area here, and you see that same range of red to blue colors denoting opportunity in Seattle based on geography. And these green dots are where most families using housing choice vouchers live. And we see that the vast majority of these families are living in these red areas. Housing choice vouchers, an incredibly important tool that we spend billions of dollars on every year to provide housing stability to millions of families. But in some ways, it may actually be perpetuating the same discrimination, segregation that I think has created many of these trends in the first place. And we see in Seattle around a little over 10% of families using housing choice vouchers end up in higher opportunity places where we know those kids will have better outcomes in the long term. So one thing we did, and actually housing authorities, after some of our research came out, actually came to us. They said, we've been thinking around these same issues. How can we partner and figure out how to create better outcomes and more opportunity for our residents, for the folks who we're working for? And I think, especially for this crowd, I really want to focus on this collaboration. So you had a group of researchers at Opportunity Insights, the housing authorities in Seattle and King County, research and evaluation organizations like JPAL North America and MDRC, along with nonprofit service providers and the Gates and Serga Foundation, all came together to think around this issue, to use the research, use practitioner knowledge, use the knowledge of folks who are in these programs to think around how we can create more opportunity through programs like housing choice vouchers. And so what we did was ran a randomized trial with a suite of services to better understand how we can break down those barriers to higher opportunity neighborhoods. And in this case, that involved housing search counselors who would work directly with families, engagement with landlords to really break down the stigma around both families using housing choice vouchers, but also trying to cut down red tape through the programs in the housing authorities, along with short-term financial assistance to support families with costs like moving expenses and security deposits. And so what we saw is that for families who were receiving these housing vouchers during the same time period but didn't receive the extra services, similar to the historical rates, around 14% ended up moving to high opportunity places. But those families that received those extra services were actually 4 times more likely to move to these high opportunity neighborhoods. Right? And these are moves that in the data we see that these children on average will earn almost $200,000 more over their lifetimes because these neighborhoods where they grow up, more likely to attend college and less likely to end up incarcerated. So with one intervention, potentially having a very large impact on the long-term outcomes of these families and their children. And interestingly, these families who received these services, they weren't just moving to one apartment building out in the suburbs of Seattle. So the high opportunity areas in blue and families that receive services are represented by those green pins. Ended up moving to a wide range of areas throughout Seattle and King County. So it looks like this support they received through the program was really broadening their opportunity where they were able to access throughout this region. And what I find almost most important is how the folks in this program felt about their outcomes. So families who received these services were much more likely to feel satisfied with their new neighborhood and felt much more likely to stay in the unit where they moved. And it's important to note, these numbers aren't just for those families who moved to the quote-unquote higher opportunity places. These are for all those families who received those services. So even if they didn't move to a place that in the data was defined as high opportunity, they were moving to a place where they felt more comfortable. And I think that's really key to this intervention. It's not about telling people what they should do or being paternalistic, but it's providing people with information, breaking down the barriers they're facing in their everyday lives to help them make the best decisions on behalf of themselves and their families. And we see that reflected in the conversations we have with them after going through this program. And I think another piece, outside of the housing context, there are lessons to learn as well. When you think about going through the rental process, trying to find a new housing unit, especially in a place like New York, I think it's stressful for anybody, right? Think about a family who may have been homeless, right? Who only has 90 days to find a unit or they lose this voucher. And then think about trying to find units in new places that they might not be familiar with. And we see that for the families who receive these services, right, it was a flood of relief. Just having that assistance through this process made a very big difference. And that feeling of optimism, of receiving that support, being empowered with knowledge, and knowing that the decision you're making will have a real tangible impact on the life of your child and your family. And I think what we find especially exciting is that beyond this individual pilot program, we were happy to see the good results, but it's also starting to impact a national conversation, right? So housing policy, not just about creating more units, but leveraging housing policy as a springboard to opportunity. I think when we can show in the data that this is not just about one piece of the policy conversation, but is actually a poverty fighting mechanism, can increase upwardly mobile rates. It can actually, when it seems impossible, create some bipartisan momentum. And so last year a bill was passed that would create 500,000 new vouchers and additional resources to provide services like those in the Creating Moves to Opportunity program. It hasn't been passed yet, so if any of you have some friends in Congress that you can talk to, we would be very much obliged if you would do that. But I think just this being introduced in today's political climate speaks to the power that data can have in pushing forward these conversations. And we're seeing similar conversations happen at the local level. I was in Washington, D.C. a few months ago with Mayor Bowser talking about their new housing equity plan, right? So thinking about, again, not just creating new affordable housing, but creating it in every single planning area in the district, especially in places that historically have not been as amenable to new affordable housing. In Oregon and Minneapolis, looking at issues like zoning, right? Another mechanism that historically has kept people out of high opportunity places. How can we reverse those trends through legislation, both nationally and locally, to increase access for all families, to have a greater range of possibilities in terms of where they can live and where they can raise their children? All right, so do a little experiment here. I'm a little nervous about it. I'm not totally social media savvy, but part of this is about actually creating dialogue, right? So I know we'll have a Q&A at the end of this, but I want to keep this conversation going, and I want to take advantage of the crowd that's here today. So we're a research and policy lab. I think we're consistently trying to get better at using our research to influence and support policymakers and practitioners. I would love to hear from you all, right? What are the ways that we can spread these messages more effectively? Right, through your organizations, through networks that you're aware of, using opportunity impact and no city limits, and you can tag me and my organization. Would love to get your ideas about how we further this conversation more broadly. Again, we'll see how this works, but I'm very optimistic. But so next, so that was one example of our research and a concrete way of translating it into policy. But what are other areas that we need to worry about? So of course, the importance of place. Not just moving to opportunity, but how do we support our communities more effectively in place so that all families have opportunity regardless of where they live. What we can start with is looking at the traits of places that have these higher rates of mobility. So probably not surprising, but lower poverty rates. Right? I think places that are isolated in terms of race and class generally don't have as good of outcomes. So how do we actually integrate our communities in a more thoughtful way? Better school quality. So not just places that have better test scores, but places that actually support low-income kids especially. Greater social capital. I think this is something that oftentimes is hard to put a finger on. It's a bit of a nebulous concept, but one thing we see is that we don't necessarily see a correlation between the location of jobs and neighborhood upward mobility, but we see a correlation between the proportion of employed adults in the neighborhood and upward mobility rates for the kids who grow up there. Right? So I think it really speaks to being able to see people locally that you can relate to, that model pathways to college and to stable careers. And interestingly, we see in places that have a higher proportion of two-parent households, right? So having fathers present in neighborhoods. It could speak to a wide range of issues, just financial stability in general, but I think, again, for me, it points to seeing folks that you can relate to, that can model pathways into the middle class and beyond. And again, mentioned what we see when people move across neighborhoods, and want to reiterate the point that it's not just early childhood or adolescence, but it really looks like every year up until you get to at least your mid-20s has real impact. So how can we more effectively support kids at every stage of development? How do we create that network of services and supports that can push them, again, through the neighborhood, into college, and into stable careers? And the last thing is, we also see that neighborhoods are hyper-local. Right? So characteristics just a half mile away seem to have very little bearing on the mobility of that place. So neighborhood to neighborhood impacts are very local. So how do we really make sure that our efforts are targeted and tailored towards that actual neighborhood unit? So that's another part of our work, is looking at those programs and policies that are effective, that have an evidence base, and creating that strong network of services, and looking at models like the Harlem Children's Zone, Strive Together, purpose-built communities, organizations trying to bring all those interventions together in a holistic and thoughtful way. And we as researchers try and figure out how we can build the evidence base for these programs to really equip these folks on the ground with these practices that we know will have impact and help push outcomes in the long term. So second try at this. Again, I'm here to learn from you. Right? What are the promising programs in your communities that you fund, that you support, that you work with. I think there is not enough evidence today of exactly what works, but there's great work happening on the ground every single day. And the more we're aware of that, the more we're able to contribute to that conversation and hopefully build that evidence base up. So second time, if there are things you're aware of happening in your community, we'd love to hear about it from you. And I think one great example here in New York of how we can really impact place is in higher ed and the CUNY system. And even kind of built into their founding documents, this idea of being a vehicle for upward mobility of the disadvantaged here locally in New York. And so you may be familiar with the CUNY Seek program. It impacts thousands of students every year across several CUNY campuses. And it's basically a support system for low-income students. So low-income students who are below the academic index get a bump and are admitted to CUNY, but are then provided additional supportive services to make sure that they're succeeding while they're in school. And what we've done is similar to how we can track outcomes at the neighborhood level. We're also able to track outcomes tied to different colleges and universities. So what we see is that for Seek students, those students who are admitted to CUNY and receive those services and supports, on average, they're earning about $50,000 in adulthood after they graduate. And what we do is that we compare that to kids who applied to CUNY but whose parents make too much money. They had similar test scores as those Seek students, but weren't admitted because they weren't low income and didn't qualify for the program. And we see on average those students actually make a little bit less than their counterparts, their low income counterparts, who are part of the Seek program. And then our second control group is students who applied to CUNY and were also low income, but had higher SAT scores and therefore didn't qualify for the Seek program. So they attended CUNY, didn't receive those services, and weren't part of the Seek program. And on average, they're making a similar income in adulthood as those same Seek students. So in many ways, this is a very clear example of a program that's actually evening the playing field. It's creating more access for low-income students who might be a little bit behind the curve in terms of academics after high school. But we see that in adulthood, they're having outcomes just as good as their wealthier and sometimes more academically prepared peers. So I think it's a really powerful example of a community and a college system really serving as an engine of economic mobility and doing so in a very thoughtful and targeted way. And I think there are dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of other examples that are already happening today. And how do we bring all those things together in our communities? All right. I think one issue that I think we always talk about, but I really wanted to emphasize today, is the impact that race plays in this context and that we cannot overlook. So this same map that we looked at earlier, again, looking at economic mobility rates across the country, we can also break that down by race. So this map is comparing that same economic mobility measure, but looking at black men compared to white men. And one thing to note is that these two maps are on the same color scale, right? So what that's saying is that even the best places in terms of outcomes for black men are still worse than the worst places for white men. And we can look at New York specifically, right? So a young white man growing up in New York in a low-income family, on average is earning $35,000, whereas their black counterpart in the same community, in a similarly low-income family, is only making $23,000, right? That is a dramatic difference, right? So what is it that's causing these outcomes in communities across the country? Interestingly, we see a very different map when we look at black women versus white women, right? So conditional on income, on parental income, black women and white women actually earn the same in adulthood, have similar wage rates, similar hours worked, right? So what is it that is specifically impacting black men in a very unique way? And it's so impactful that we see it for high-income black men as well, right? So this chart is comparing the outcomes of black and white men who grew up in high-income families. Black men are represented by those pink dots, and you can see that cascading effect, right, where black men who grow up in high-income families are actually more likely to end up as low-income adults. Whereas you see white men tend to float towards the top, right? Those who grow up in high-income families tend to remain high-income adults. Right? So what is happening in our communities that even black men who grew up in stable, affluent communities are still being pulled down by this downward mobility trend? And one thing we can look at are incarceration rates. Right? So comparing what kind of household you grew up in with the chance of being incarcerated. Right? We see that black men who are growing up in families that earn over $100,000 are as likely to be incarcerated by a white man growing up making around $30,000. Right? So again, what is happening? How do we intervene in ways that can specifically target what's happening in terms of race in our country? And similarly, looking at this New York map, similar to the country, again, we see these great disparities in outcomes. But one thing that we try and do is, let's look for those outliers, right? You see on this map to the right of black men growing up in New York, you see a few areas that are blue. Right? So what's happening in these neighborhoods where we see these higher outcomes, where we see these better outcomes for black men specifically? And I think one thing that I was struck by in the data is the importance of black fathers specifically. So even if you don't have a father in your own household, we've seen the data that neighborhoods that have a higher presence of black fathers, all those young black men have better outcomes in adulthood. I think, again, it really speaks to that role model effect, seeing someone you can relate to, seeing someone that can show you the path out of your neighborhood and into a better future. Not necessarily out of your neighborhood, but into a better future. But again, we look at the data, and I think that is a bright light, that ability to impact outcomes, that ability of role models to have a real impact, I think is very heartening to me. But what we see is that for white men, the majority of white men grow up in places that have low poverty rates and have high father presence. Whereas for black men, that number is about 4%. And similarly, only 1% of white men grow up in high poverty places that have low father presence, whereas almost 2/3 of black men grow up in those environments. So again, housing policy, racial segregation, but also how do we invest more effectively in our communities to support all families and all children? And how do we specifically look at issues of race and how they manifest within our communities? So last time I'll bug you. But specifically in your organizations, right? What are you doing and what can you do to specifically interrogate issues of race and how they're impacting the folks we work with, the folks we work for, and our communities more broadly? I think in the research community, we need to be specifically looking at, investigating, and rigorously evaluating more interventions that are specifically targeted at issues of race. Right? What are the programs focused on black men, on the criminal justice system, on employment discrimination, on discipline in schools? How do we as researchers not have a blind eye to those issues? And how do we build that evidence base up? So I think that is important for us to do, but I also would leave you to think about what can you do in your everyday lives, in your professional life, within your organizations to focus on all the policy issues we've talked about, but making sure not to forget about the impact that race has on our conversations as well. Again, I'm heartened to be here. I think rooms like this give me hope. I think the data shows that we can make a real difference, but it also shows how far that we have to go as well. But I think that if we're dedicated to using data, but also not relying on it, making sure that we are dedicated to building the political will to do what the data shows us we need to do, I think we have the real possibility of not just having the American dream, but turning the American dream into the American reality. Thank you.
And now, to present David with audience questions, please welcome Robin Hood's Viam Ball.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. David, thank you for such an incredible presentation. It's such an honor for Robinhood to be able to partner with Opportunity Insights. And thank you all for putting questions onto Slido. We're testing new technology, and it turns out it's working, which is amazing. The Wi-Fi, spot on here at Convene. So I think we've gotten dozens of questions, but I think one that sort of might just be helpful to orient folks who are all working in very different areas of social services is thinking through the 4 characteristics that you outlined of a high opportunity neighborhood. Can you tell us if there's a weighting in terms of importance? Are those 4 things interwoven? Is there something that matters more than something else in terms of creating economic mobility?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, like all kind of correlations, they are interwoven, right? I don't think we're going to be able to pick one statistic out and that'll help us fix the problem. But interestingly, the factor that we see most highly correlated with upward mobility is that proportion of 2-parent households, which I think is, in different contexts, plays out very differently. I think some people focus on, we should then encourage marriage. I think for others, it's thinking about the criminal justice system and why aren't fathers present, especially black fathers in many of our communities. But I think what those factors speak to, it's not necessarily that there's one solution or one issue driving it. I think it speaks to how all these things really are interwoven and how we need to, I think, in places specifically, really create those holistic efforts to really bring support across the entire life cycle. But also, I think it speaks to the complexity of the problem and kind of how neighborhoods and places are very textured. And it takes a lot of thoughtful work across sectors to really tackle these issues.
Also seems like that response ties into the notion that having black men in community, irrespective of whether they're in the household, might actually have pretty profound effects on the outcomes of young black men. And so even the notion of a 2-parent household is perhaps more complex than just having 2 married people in one physical unit. A sort of similar question is about employment. You mentioned that the number of employed adults contributes to higher opportunity neighborhoods. Do we know anything about how much the type of employment matters, the wages of the people who are working, as it relates to creating opportunity for mobility?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of our research has focused on human capital development in childhood. And so kind of how are you preparing kids to enter the job market by the time they're in college and graduating from college? But I think ultimately, it's tough to be economically mobile without a good job, right? So if there aren't jobs that pay a living wage, it's probably going to be tough to see those numbers really go up. I think the intersection between wage rates, the economy more broadly, and human capital development in childhood is a very complex thing, right? I think we don't know exactly how all those things interact, but I think what we see in that initial chart, that fading American dream slide, is we see that human capital development hasn't kept up with global competition, right? So I think there really is going to need to be both that human capital development side and thinking really critically around our job market, what good paying jobs mean in the future and how we bring those 2 things together.
Great. Shifting gears a little bit, talking specifically about moving to opportunity, a clarification question about the program in Seattle. Can you reiterate for us what exactly the services were that were provided in the program in Seattle and describe whether or not participation was self-selected or randomized?
Definitely. So it was randomized. So families who are coming off the waitlist for housing choice vouchers, they were talked to by a consultant for the program if they wanted to participate in the program, and then at that point they were randomized into those families who received those services and those families who received business as usual through the Housing Authority program. And the services specifically were receiving a housing navigator, right? So basically a caseworker who would help walk the family through the rental search process, who would educate them about opportunity areas, kind of take them on tours of those neighborhoods, and again, kind of work directly with them as they were talking with and working with landlords who had units available. And similarly, working with landlords, right? So engaging landlords, educating them about the program, making sure they were comfortable with the program, and kind of keeping a roster of landlords available for those families moving through the program. And then those housing navigators had access to extra dollars for those families, right? So if a family needed in a pinch more money to pay for that security deposit or for moving expenses, that counselor was able to provide them those resources to help facilitate that move. But I think what we saw was that it was not just the individual components of the program, but having that individual, that housing counselor who could work directly with that family and help them through their needs specifically. So I think we see that these families are going through a lot of different issues. So having someone that could help tailor the services to their particular needs, that seemed to be particularly impactful in this program.
So a contentious question. We got probably, I'd say, a dozen, all kind of a similar flavor. And your presentation started by addressing the opportunity to move to a different neighborhood, and then you spoke about transforming place. I think people are very curious about the inherent tensions in pursuing both of those strategies at the same time. So combining a few questions, does the movement of families through vouchers from low opportunity to high opportunity neighborhoods leave those behind more desolate, worsening the low income area? And sort of put more succinctly, why do people have to move to access opportunity?
Definitely, yeah. I think the key to that question is people don't have to move to access opportunity. I think at its core, I think of it as an issue of justice. Just because given our history, people haven't had the choice of where they want to live. So I think number one is actually giving families choice in general. The choice to stay where they are and flourish there, or the choice to be in a place that they feel is best for them. And so that's why I think that the place-based work and the housing access and mobility work really needs to work together. Because I think, and even to an earlier question, right, that lower poverty rate correlates with upward mobility. Right? I think if we're a country that continues to be okay with having some neighborhoods that are high poverty and isolated and other neighborhoods that become increasingly wealthy, I doubt we're going to be able to, on scale, invest in those higher poverty places in a way that will actually help transform them and support those families. So I think that by both thinking very critically around how we can roll back segregation and really create integrated communities in a thoughtful way, and then also be able to invest in more targeted and efficient ways, I think those things really have to work together. I don't think they can work separately if we really want to have transformative impact at a large scale.
A follow-up question that's just come through. Your slides showed the level of satisfaction between treatment and control groups, meaning people who received the support to move into a neighborhood of their choice and those who didn't. But were you able to dissect the data based on whether someone moved to a high opportunity neighborhood or not? And did satisfaction vary based on the neighborhood that household might have ended up in?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the numbers are a little too low when you cut it that many ways. I'm not the economist, so I can kind of fudge the numbers a little bit. And so it does look like, so those families who didn't necessarily move to a higher opportunity place, who received those services, they still seem more satisfied with that neighborhood. And that at least is very heartening for me. Because again, I don't think it's about telling people where to move, but I think it's about bringing down those barriers and empowering those families to make that choice. And it does look like that choice in and of itself does seem to increase that satisfaction. And I think my hope is that, again, I think the data is very powerful in showing where kids do have better outcomes on average. But I think that if a family is making that better choice, right, perhaps it's because they have a great social network locally, or they have a great network of churches, or they're part of an ethnic community that's very strong in a place. So I think if families are making that choice, and it's not based on barriers, but based on empowerment, my sense is that they'll have better outcomes as well.
So much of your data is focused on the age at which someone moves, the length of time that they have exposure to that higher opportunity neighborhood. What can you tell us about adults and what prospects they might have to move out of poverty? As we know, adults are a big share of those who are low income in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I found interesting, even before starting Opportunity Insights, but a lot of the research about moving to opportunity, right, it was somewhat disappointing because you didn't see the same income outcomes for adults. But you do see better health outcomes, and I think better feelings of autonomy as well. So I think it is true that we don't have, at least in our research, we don't see as many examples of interventions focused on adults that have those kind of transformative income outcomes. But I think we do see that, one, real change happens when we support families through programs like CMTO, when we give them support through different systems, helping them navigate things like their earned income tax credit or other supports. I think those are extremely important, and we see that trickle down for those kids as well. And I think part of the issue is that, right, you can't impact kids without impacting the adults in their lives. So I think, again, it is true, there's more research that we need to do to figure out, what are more effective workforce programs, right? What are ways that we can help push adults up the income ladder? But right? We're not going to be able to impact kids without supporting their parents and communities at large as well.
A couple more minutes left. So zooming a bit out from the results of the data to asking questions about data itself, and the data that we have access to, and importantly, the data that we don't have access to. So one question, several questions came along this flavor. How do we make big data more inclusive? Particularly thinking about the nature of New York, 3 million immigrants, more than 500,000 who are undocumented. If you rely on IRS data, are there narratives that we're not identifying because so many policies and government programs exclude those communities, and perhaps data sets do as well?
Yeah, so kind of one macro thing we're working on is called the American Opportunity Study. We're working with the Census Bureau to create an even longer longitudinal data set going back for the past 50 years to be able to look at a wide range of policies and outcomes. And we're hoping to basically create a data spine that'll actually be accessible to a much wider range of researchers. So I think Raj is very dedicated to making all this open source. So even the maps that I showed, it's all online at opportunityatlas.org. You can download the data or even search for your own neighborhoods where you live or you work. So that's part of our mission, right, is that we only have so much bandwidth, so how can we make the data accessible in ways that other researchers can use it as well? But I think that is an issue also, right, is that undocumented workers aren't captured in the same way that everyone else is. And I think it speaks to, I think we should also acknowledge that the data can't do everything. That it's a starting point. I think it can help facilitate good conversations, but I think the qualitative work is very important as well, right? How do we bring the precision of the big data with the lived experience on the ground to think about what these interventions potentially look like?
And so as one final question, thinking about where the data stops and where we in this room have the obligation to pick up, several questions around whether or not data are the issue. And whether or not data are enough to move policy. You showed a map of the South Bronx as being a low opportunity neighborhood. That's certainly not new information for folks who've been working and fighting poverty in New York City for a long time. So what's the gap that you think we can fill? How does this data empower us differently to make shifts in policies and programs that we haven't been able to make for decades?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And in part, I'll rely on all of you and my little Twitter poll. But again, I think it's a starting point. I think data can help bridge conversations. I think we're all working, I hope, towards the same outcome. And I think empowering those conversations of knowing what works, I think is very powerful. But it's a question of political will as well. I think you can have all the data in the world. If you don't have willing participants, it's not going to move the needle. So I think in many ways, hopefully at the margin, something like CMTO, I think the data in showing that this, again, not only can help housing stability, but actually increase and decrease poverty, I think that has helped bring folks together around that issue, both on Democrat and Republican side. But I don't think it'll do it in every area. So I think actually acknowledging the limits of the data and understanding when it won't take us that far and figuring out what are the other avenues that we need to pursue, I think is extremely important.
Amazing. Thank you so much, David. Thank you all for
Thank
the
you.
questions. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.